Bible in the 21st century. We're looking at various themes and looking at what the Bible says about these themes. This is part of a series where we're looking at end times. What does the Bible say? What can we glean about end times, particularly from the New Testament and the teaching of Jesus? This is a third presentation in this series. In the second one, we looked at what Jesus did not say about his return. Now we're coming to the positive side, what he actually did say. There's a lot of confusion about this. It goes back to the questions the disciples put to Jesus, sitting on the Mount of Olives, across the valley and looking at the temple. Jesus had predicted the whole temple would be sacked, not one stone left on another, a magnificent building destroyed. The disciples come to him and they say, "Tell us," they said, "when will this happen? What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" Now they were confused because they assumed that the destruction of the temple would be so dreadful, the complete destruction of the heart of the Jewish religion. That must be the end of the age. That must be the return of Jesus. Jesus was coming to release the people of Israel from the Roman overlords, set them free to be a people again. That's what they thought. But they had it wrong. So they ask about the sacking of the temple. That's the first question. And the second question is the coming of Jesus, the return of Jesus. And they assumed they were the same. And the word that's used there is the word that's always used of the return of Jesus, the word that speaks of a Lord coming to be received by his people. And the word end there uses the other rather unusual word which speaks of the complete and total end, everything wound up. And age reflects the way they thought in the culture of those days when they thought of the present age and the age to come. Now what Jesus showed was that the destruction of the temple and his return are totally unrelated. Now, looking back over history, that's now obvious. The total destruction of the temple took place in AD 70. Jesus has yet to return. But yet we get it confused. And that holds the key. When we recognize that Jesus, in chapter 24 up to verse 35, he's answering their first question, but at verse 36, he turns to answer the second question, and the actual words that are used make it quite clear. There can be no doubt about it. The separation of the two questions and the replies. And all the supposed signs of the times from the first 35 verses, these refer to the temple destruction. History shows they actually were fulfilled. They're nothing to do with the return of Jesus. The answer to that question starts at verse 36. When we've got that, it all drops into place and makes complete sense for us. So we're going to look at verse 36 onwards, and it starts with that simple phrase, "but concerning," and that is always used in the language structure of the day to indicate a change of subject matter. I'm moving on to the second question, says Jesus. No longer does he refer to days, but he refers to a day, something specific. The destruction of the nation of Israel and the sacking of Jerusalem and the temple, that spanned quite a few years. So it's very different from the early part of the chapter. And he makes it quite clear that the timing of his return is not known and cannot be known. And that stands in stark contrast to the first 35 verses, where he's speaking about the sacking of the temple. Now we have the key word parousia, which is always the word biblical authors used about the return of Jesus. The coming of an emperor to be received by his people was the way it would be used in the language of the day. So it's a specific word, and it makes it quite clear now this is what he's talking about. And in this section there's no timing phrases. So you don't get phrases like immediately or in those days. You can't, because it's not talking about something within time. It's the end of time. So the first 35 verses, that is all set in time and history. And history, when we look at it, shows that it's all been fulfilled up to the destruction of the temple in AD 70. From verse 36 onwards speaks about the return of Jesus, and then the implications of his return into end of chapter 25. That's set in eschatology, the fancy word that just means end times, when Jesus returns to wrap up history once and for all. And there are two things that are kind of in tension in this section. Two ideas that seem contradictory. It's going to be delayed, but it could happen at any time. That's the biblical picture, and we've got to hold that tension in our minds. The fact that it's not happened doesn't mean it won't happen, and it won't happen tomorrow or even later today. That's the tension that the Bible pictures, that Jesus pictures. And it's true to reality. We'll develop that further in a moment. Now, just an overview of this section very quickly. Verse 36 to 44, Jesus gives some basic teaching about his return. The parousia of Jesus, his arrival, to be received by his people. Then he gives three parables from the end of chapter 24 through to verse 30 of chapter 25. The faithful servant, the 10 virgins, unfortunate description, and the talents, another unfortunate description. And then there's the parable of the sheep and the goats, which speaks about the final judgment. And the point Jesus makes is that my return will be unexpected, unpredictable, so you've got to be ready. And if it's unpredictable, there can be no signs of the times. And the message of the parables, in very simple terms, responsible leadership till I return. Being ready for my return, which is unpredictable, unexpected, and using the resources that are given to us by the Holy Spirit for the purposes Jesus has given them. And then is laid down the criteria for being accepted by Jesus into his kingdom. Now we're going just to quickly unravel these stories, but it's worth looking at the actual text of the actual teaching of Jesus. But about that day or hour, that says the return, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. Now, if Jesus doesn't know, what right have we to say that we can predict when he's going to return? There can be no signs of the times. Then he uses an illustration from the days of Noah. For in the days before the flood, people were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage up to the day Noah entered the ark. They knew nothing about what would happen until the flood came and took them all away. No warning. This is how it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. Correct word for the return of Jesus. Coming, the parousia of the Son of Man. No warning. 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken, the other left. 2 women will be grinding with a handmill, one will be taken, the other left. People have built all sorts of things on that, but it makes assumptions. It is not clear whether the one taken is going to be with Jesus, or the one left is going to be with Jesus. The point here is the unpredictability and the suddenness of his return. So don't build all sorts of theological empires in these sentences. He goes on, therefore keep watch, because you do not know on what day your Lord will come. But understand this, if the owner of the house had known at what time of night the thief was coming, he would have kept watch and would not have let his house be broken into. So you also must be ready, because the Son of Man will come at an hour when you do not expect him. And how can there be signs of times when we do not expect him? No warnings given. Timing is not known. Just summarizing this very briefly. There will be no warnings, no signs of the times. That's an illustration of the unpredictability, but we don't know which one is going to be preferred, the taken or the left. We cannot predict his return. And the idea of signs of the times simply is the misunderstanding of the early part of the chapter, which should never have happened because the original language is crystal clear. Now, overall, he makes 4 key points. No one can predict when it will happen. Well, people have down through the years have pretended they could, but no one can. There will be no warnings at all. The tragedy is that amongst Christian communities today, we think we know better than Jesus, and people talk about the terrible things happening in the world today as this is the signs that the world's getting near the end. People said the same things at the times of the Second World War in Europe. People said the same things in the great plagues that struck Europe and wiped out 1/3 of the population in the Middle Ages. No one can predict. There will be no warnings at all. So we've got to live here and now, expecting it could happen anytime, even today. That's the critical point. And the parables make that crystal clear. I stress this because it's an area of utter confusion. If you've been one who's talked about the signs of the times, don't criticize or condemn yourselves. But step back, think again, and look at it. It cannot be true. Now, the 3 parables. The trustworthy servant. I'm changing the title to our other better title, the 10 teenage girls. You'll see why in a moment. And I've got rid of that awful word talents, using the given resources. Let's look at the first one, the trustworthy servant. This is standard procedure at that time. A servant actually was a slave, and slaves could hold very high positions in a home, was left in charge of his master's affairs when the master was away. He could faithfully fulfill the duties, just as if his master was there. Or he could indulge in wild, irresponsible living. He's not here, I can do what I like, I've got all power. The master then returns unexpectedly, no warnings. And the point Jesus is making there is, we cannot know when Jesus will return. So, we are all called to carry out our tasks in a responsible and trustworthy manner. Get on with living and doing what he wants us to do, and do it in a responsible and trustworthy way. There's a very deep thought here. It's true in all life there are consequences for actions. But our actions reveal the inner state of our mind. Our actions reveal our spiritual state as well. And therefore the actions bring about a separation when the master returns, acceptance or rejection, because they reveal the inner state of our mind. Let's look briefly at the second parable, the 10 teenage girls. Now this is traditional in the culture of the time. Teenagers, probably 13, 14, 15. They're not yet married. And girls were married off very young in those days. Their task was to escort the bridegroom in a torchlit procession to his house, for the wedding banquet. That's just part of the procedure. The lamps they carried were the portable lamps. For some reason there was a long delay and all 10 girls fell asleep, but 5 of them had taken the proper steps to prepare themselves for their duties. And the point Jesus is making is that preparation for the return of Jesus cannot be left until he comes. We must be ready now, expecting that he could come today. That's the way we live, positively and radiantly for him. And there's a similar message. There are consequences for actions. And what we do reveals the inner state of our mind. These girls had, 5 of them had prepared, 5 of them had not. That revealed the inner state of their mind about the importance of the duties they were to perform. But our actions, because they reveal the inner state of our being, they bring about separation, as 5 girls found to their cost. Let's look at the third parable. The problem is this word talent. It's a transliteration of the original language, but the meaning is completely different in English compared to the original language. In the original language, a talent was a large sum of money. In fact, it was eye-wateringly large. You might never earn that amount of money in an entire lifetime. It's resources, not human abilities, which is the word talent in English speaks about our abilities. That's not the meaning. It's resources. And the meaning is literal. It always is in the way the word is used. It's speaking about large sums of money. The owner has given resources, his own resources, to us to use the resources to continue our work for him. That's what God gives us. If we're followers of Jesus, God releases his resources to us here and now so that we can expand his kingdom, allow it to grow and develop and enrich the lives of others. We get different levels of these resources. Depends how well we can cope with things, and he knows what's best. The key is how we employ his resources wherever we're given. Again, this idea of a long time. Part of this is that the disciples thought the return of Jesus was imminent. It's part of their culture. And he's pointing out, you don't know when it's coming, and it could be a long time down the line. But these people had to use their resources, and that requires effort, rolling up their sleeves, getting on with it, and it requires taking risks. Now there is an interesting picture for us today. The Holy Spirit gives infinite resources to us if we will receive them. But these resources are no use unless we cooperate, use the resources, and take risks for Jesus. And the reward is more responsibilities. What a fulfillment. When we're given responsibilities, that lifts us, it lifts our self-esteem, it encourages us. That's pretty blunt. We're given the resources of Jesus to be part of his kingdom, to work in his kingdom, to live for him, to bring benefit to those around, to enrich the lives of those around, to draw other people in. We've got responsibilities to use the resources Jesus provides for us by his Spirit. And we're back to the same pattern. There are consequences for what we do, because what we do speaks volumes about the inner state of our being. But as in the other two stories, the actions, what we do, brings us into God's presence in Jesus, or separation. Now the sheep and the goats is somewhat different. And the language shows it's somewhat different because this is after the return of Jesus. It's the final coming to God, where all humanity we face our Maker. And the phrase there means all of us. And all the work of Jesus in building his kingdom is presented to the Father. The kingdom is now complete. Jesus is enthroned. The final judgment. The word judgment, he's coming to put things right. Now, sheep and goats were both valuable in that culture, and unlike today, they were rather similar in appearance. So you couldn't separate them or see the differences unless you were a very skilled shepherd. Jesus leads his people, but is also the judge who puts things right. Life in this world can be so unjust and unfair, sometimes through no fault of our own. In the end, Jesus puts things right. He brings justice, judgment, and he puts things right. But it speaks of an ultimate separation. One group are described as blessed, which means enjoying God's favour. And they are invited to enter into the kingship. And that's a mind-blowing thought. It's a picture of separation. But it's this bit that makes us feel uncomfortable. They didn't know why they're going one way or the other, and it's because of how they'd lived their lives. Or more bluntly, how they had treated other people. Actions speak of what's in our inner being. What they'd done for the hungry, the thirsty, the stranger, those needing clothes, those who were ill, and those imprisoned. These were 6 horrendous problems in the societies of the days of Jesus. And it speaks of how we treat other people. That's the basis of the separation. Now let's translate that into our society today. There's my attempt to just bring it into the major needs in the world today. While we in the West have got problems about overeating, there are large numbers in other parts of the world who are simply starving, who can barely get one meal a day. What are we doing about it? They're God's children too. While we have our showers and our water supplies, there are people in the world today who don't have any clean water at all. Children forced to drink dirty water, dying prematurely. What are we doing about these problems today? What about the refugee and the lonely? So often, if the refugee doesn't satisfy our political criteria, we send them back, often to punishment, persecution, and death. There are people today who don't have the mechanisms and the means to make their clothes. There are people today who are denied basic education. What are we doing about that? There is illness running rife throughout the world. As I make this recording, we're still in the pandemic. We have in the West denied these people access to the vaccines. One day we will face our Maker over that issue. And in the world today, the followers of Jesus are being brutalized in many nations, suffering totally unfairly. Across the Islamic world and the communist and totalitarian states, it's common. What are we doing about these people in their need? These are the issues in which we will be judged when it comes to the end of time. That's what it is today. There's a huge impact for us right now, here, today. What are we doing about these issues? And there may be many more. We don't like that. We're so used to be justification by faith, which is absolutely true. Jesus did it for us on the cross, and it becomes meaningful to us when we respond to him. But the meaningfulness will change how we treat other people. The evidence of what is within us lies in how we treat others. That's what Jesus is saying. How well do we match up amongst the people of God today on that criterion? We're very strong about that. You can't win God's favour by self-effort. That's absolutely true. But you see, the people then, they didn't know the significance of what they'd done or what they'd not done. They weren't doing these things for others in order to impress God. They did it because it was an expression of the inner change in their lives. Because how we behave speaks of how we are inside. And the word that's used is serving others. A natural inner expression of love that comes from God, and God's moving in our lives. The evidence about God moving in our lives and our response to Jesus, it lies in how we treat other people. And the word eternal is a word that speaks of quality, not quantity. We've got that misunderstood. He's speaking about the quality of life that's the life of God's age. The wonderful life that God can give us. And the future lies in two clear directions. Jesus spells it out brutally clearly. We're enjoying God's favour in further serving, or we're losing everything. The fire is not literal, but it speaks of destruction. The essential nature of our being is gone. What a horrendous thought. That's what Satan wants us to do. Put ourselves first, plan things out, look after ourselves and our families, our group, the people like us. The primary motive, that's what Satan wants. That's what God wants. Jesus came to release the resources through his life, death and resurrection to enable us to live for others. We don't do it to impress God, we do it as an outworking of the love of God that's worked in our lives through all Jesus has done for us. That's God's mandate. And the evidence that God's love has touched us, the evidence that God's love has transformed us, it lies in the way we treat others. Others who may be messy, critical, problems by any standards, facing impossible difficulties, hurting, damaged, whatever. Others who can probably do nothing back for us. That's the evidence of God's love in our lives. That's the point Jesus is making. And it makes total sense. Now let's just bring it together as we round this off. This is what Jesus taught, the return of Jesus. I'm going to put it under three things: the when, the what, and the how. Just bringing the key points together. The timing of the return of Jesus is known. We've got this tension between could come at any time, could be delayed. And there will be no warnings, therefore we cannot predict, therefore there can be no signs of the times. We have to live expecting it might happen today. When he does come back, all will see it, like lightning right across the entire globe. And we've got to live expecting it at any time. And we're not judged by our correct theology. Just think about how unfair that is. Because of your upbringing and your family or your circumstances, even where you were born in the world. We're judged by how we treat each other. Because how we treat others indicates what is really inside us. Are we living for the benefit of others, or are we living for the benefit of ourselves and our group? That's the great touchstone of the judgment of Jesus. In the meantime, faithfully complete the tasks that are set before you. And sometimes in life we're not sure which way to go, and I've often given this advice to people who've been puzzled, and I say, do what is at your hand to do with everything in you, depending on God's grace. God shows when a change has to be made. But we've got to be prepared to risk take for Jesus. And the evidence about how we treat other people can be seen in how we spend our time and how we spend our money. It's worth pondering. It's worth keeping a diary for the week. Now, there are things that you can't avoid. Working, looking after children, even sleeping. But the time that's available to us, do we spend it to pursue our selfish interests, or we do spend it for the benefit of others, sacrificially? Look at our money. In the West, we are stinking rich compared to what is the poverty in many countries of the world. I have been in the shanty towns around the edge of them in East Africa. These people have nothing. I've been in the Far East where the followers of Jesus there, I said to them, you have nothing. And then I looked at them and smiled and said, yet you have everything. Because in Jesus, they were secure and free. How do we spend the resources that have been given to us? That's practical. Do we give them away and expend them for the benefit of others? Sacrificial love. That's the point Jesus was making. This is the central teaching of what Jesus said about his return. It was not a topic that he emphasized greatly. This is the only really systematic teaching in our Bibles. There are bits of it in Mark's Gospel, but Matthew has a slightly longer account. But it's got great messages for us today. Now, taking a deep breath, we've looked at what Jesus did not teach and what he did teach. We moved at how Paul interpreted it in his generation.